People of color have called for a shift in how we talk about racism, pointing out that when we say racism, the people we're thinking of in our minds are actually people of color, and we can think, oh, well, it's a problem that faces people of color. But when we shift to calling it white supremacy, it makes it much clearer who actually owns the problem. I can't tell you how many times I heard people of color say, hey, white folks, you can educate yourselves. You can do this work without us being there to bring it up or being there to teach you. Before I stopped looking at everybody else in the room like, yeah, and realized they were talking to me. I didn't think I was actively harming anyone, so I thought, what do I really need to learn? And it took me a long time to realize that in not looking at how white supremacy was working, I wasn't able to see it happening or to challenge it, even when it had been clear and egregious in the news or right in front of me. I just saw it as individual incidents of violence or incarceration, not as a pattern for public concern. The Black Lives Matter movement helped me to realize how much there is for me to learn about society and about white supremacy and how it exists and how we're socialized even within myself. People of color have long lamented about the amount of work a person must do to not set off white people's defensiveness and reactions to hearing about whiteness. And when I first heard the term white fragility, I didn't think it had anything to do with me until I read about it. And then I realized, you mean like the weeks where I preach about white supremacy or race, and I can't wait for Sunday to come and be over because I'm not accustomed to holding that much awareness of the pain and the suffering of white supremacy? Oh yeah, that's exactly what they mean. For me, with my privilege, I could opt into a bubble of comfort and just step in or out as I pleased. For me to be aware of that fragility of my own spirit and how to tend to myself that I can remain open and engaged. It's taken me having willingness, courage, and commitment, and the support of white colleagues in a monthly group where we study whiteness, for me to find a role for myself in dismantling racism and white supremacy, and then to actually stick with it. I'm speaking about violence today because I long for a similar shift in how we talk about violence against women. I know that women have caused harm and that they can continue to cause harm, and this needs to be addressed. I know that a male-female binary is not the sole reality that we live in or experience, and yet today I am going to focus on men's violence towards women, given the sheer scope of the epidemic. The term violence against women sounds like this is a problem women experience, when in reality the violence and sense of entitlement and superiority it entails is men and masculinity's problem. We have to call it what it is, not violence against women, but male violence and toxic masculinity. We have so many statistics about victims. What would it be like to know about the men and the boys who are causing the harm, their ages? One in so many men have committed some kind of sexual harm, what kind of violence they perpetrated, what they were wearing, if they had been drinking, and if they were alone or in a group when it happened. When we talk about white supremacy, we're not just talking about skinheads, we're talking about the unconscious bias that people like me can unintentionally act upon. And when we talk about male violence and toxic masculinity, we're not just talking about men who lurk in the bushes, we're talking about men who unconsciously take power that doesn't belong to them, in the workplace, in conversations, and in our homes. We are all living in a status quo that needs changing, and we can all learn more about it. And to do this, if you identify as male and you are here today, you may need to do like I did to check your defensiveness, to notice if you're victim blaming, thinking women are blowing things out of proportion or that there must be an enormous amount of false accusations in the statistics I shared before. Perhaps like me, when people of color talked and I realized that I actually need to listen and think about myself, you too could listen and believe what women are saying. You could be mindful of when you seek to numb out and distance yourself from this subject. Male fragility is a real thing too. If we don't find a way to transform our pain, we will always transmit it to those around us or turn it against ourselves. If your religion is not teaching you how to recognize, hold, and transform suffering, it is junk religion. Thank you, Father Richard Rohr. We need to find a way to recognize, hold, and transform our suffering, and there is suffering. Our cultural constriction that we call masculinity is not a path of freedom or aliveness. Rebecca Solnit writes that silence is the universal condition for oppression, and silence is present everywhere in patriarchy that requires a different silence for men and for women. You can imagine the policing of gender as a creation of reciprocal silences, and you begin to recognize male silence as a trade-off for power and membership. Bell Hooks defined it like this: the first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women, but instead patriarchy demands that males engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves. If an individual is not successful in crippling himself, he can count on patriarchal men to enact rituals of power that will assault his self-esteem. Cutting off feelings other than anger or joy takes a lot of energy and a lot of reinforcement to become a way of life, to become habitual. And when this happens, when silencing oneself becomes habitual and unconscious, one may not even notice or question their sense that the expression of emotion is something that we look down upon and ascribe to women. Emotion becomes viewed as something that is foreign, something that is other. Solnit likens this to the plot of a horror or zombie movie. The deadened seek out the living to exterminate feeling, either by making their targets join them in numbness or by intimidating or assaulting them into silence. When one practices disdain towards a certain set of emotions over and over and over again in order to fit in and be a good man, it is then easy to disdain that in others and to project denigration onto others. Solnit says, a certain kind of emotional wholeness is the price men pay for power, and such renunciations begin early. Denying emotional wholeness to be a good man, whether it's done publicly, privately, or both, is not the action of a sex who is free. Beloved men, there is a role waiting for you. A role for you to recognize the suffering of masculinity, to hold and transform it. There's so much shame that comes with sexual abuse, incest, molestation, domestic violence, and emotional abuse. Shame for those who experience it, and shame for those who cause it. Shame can build a fortress of pain and silence around the abuse, so much so that those who cause the harm themselves don't even see themselves as involved in it. Studies have repeatedly shown that men will openly admit to ignoring consent and even the use of force, though when asked if they've committed rape or sexual assault, they will say no. And one psychologist said this is not the sign that the respondents are psychopaths. It's a sign that they're human. No one thinks they are a bad guy, she said. Experts note that one trait shared by men who have raped, they do not believe they are the problem. We can continue to pretend that only the unhinged rape, or we can acknowledge that some very ordinary men take power that does not belong to them. And the taking of power that does not belong to us is not limited to sexual or physical violence. Evan Stark, a researcher, shares fewer than 5% of all domestic violence involves injury. Only 1 to 2% involves serious injury, and a tiny, tiny proportion lead to homicide. So if you wait for homicide or serious injury or even injury, you miss 95% of all the incidences of domestic violence. To illustrate, he shares lists of rules men have given to their partners that police have found in homes when investigating domestic violence. Rules like vacuum daily so you can see the lines, no dog on the couch, CDs and cassettes must be in alphabetical order, and the list specifies rules going from room to room to room. And in one home, in all capitals, on the list it included no pictures of men in the house other than husband, God, or your father. No men in the house, no phone calls with men. Have sex every night, and always be a good girl at all times. Dr. Stark says we're better served by understanding this as coercive control rather than domestic violence. We'll better understand what women experience if we view them as hostages, as being kidnapped, than viewing them as battered. One doesn't say to a hostage, well, why didn't you just leave? They don't have the means to. Dr. Stark says, in most English-speaking countries, though not in the United States, coercive control is recognized as a very serious criminal offense. The UK and France have passed legislation in the last 8 years that makes psychological abuse a criminal offense that can lead to incarceration. Dr. Stark says the way we view domestic violence in the United States, it trivializes abuse and does nothing to address coercive control. There are so many ways we can take power that does not belong to us that doesn't have to be egregious, clear violations of boundaries. There's much more for us to be curious about and examine in our lives. One cannot take power that does not belong to them and not suffer for it. Men's violence against women doesn't just hurt women, just as white supremacy doesn't just hurt people of color. Whites who enslaved Black people perpetrated immense violence and cruelty on a daily basis. As Booker T. Washington said, you can't hold a man down without staying down with him. And when masculinity views the bodies and minds of the feminine as less than, as something different and less human, we see another form of justification for the unconscionable. Shame is a primary barrier to our willingness to look at or even acknowledge how we think about one another, ourselves, and how we act that out. And although shame can be overwhelming, it is not impenetrable. It is not insurmountable. It merely hides the truth about who we are. We are more than our actions, more than our worst actions, more than our bad choices, our harmful ways of getting our needs met, or protecting ourselves. Ending white supremacy and toxic masculinity requires listening to people who are marginalized, victimized, and minoritized, and then actually believing what they say. It's opening to the idea that even if we don't think we're an agent of harm, perhaps our ignorance is merely a shield protecting our own sense of fragility and shame. A colleague, Tom Shade, shared with me this understanding of humanity, that we are all of the nature to oppress, and we are all of the nature to resist oppression. We have all caused harm at one point or another, to various degrees, and most likely, many times, and will continue to. Let us hold ourselves and each other with compassion, with the kind of love that can hold self-examination and learning without being paralyzed by the shame and pain we may find. As Unitarian Universalists, we covenant with one another to affirm the inherent worth and dignity of all people, which means we covenant with one another, to hold all people with compassion, even when they harm us, even when they don't listen to us talk about that harm, even when we recognize we're the ones who have caused the harm. May we support one another in having the courage to listen and learn, in living and loving generously, that we might do what we can to nurture a more just world. Amen.